Miriam had always believed in the sanctity of marriage. She had met Ryan in Chicago 15 years ago when she was a fresh graduate, full of dreams, and he was an ambitious man climbing the corporate ladder. Their love story had been one of those typical yet magical ones. Long walks by Lake Michigan, late-night drives through the city, and endless conversations about their future. When he proposed to her on a chilly December evening at Millennium Park, she had thought her life was set in stone. A love so deep, a marriage so strong. What could ever go wrong? For years, Miriam had been the perfect wife. She managed the home, took care of their 2 kids, and supported Ryan through every challenge in his career. She had given up her own dreams of pursuing a full-time career in journalism because Ryan's job required frequent relocations. They had moved from Chicago to New York, then to Dallas, and finally settled in Houston. Each move was a sacrifice, but Miriam never complained. She believed that love was about compromise, about putting family first. But somewhere along the way, things changed. It wasn't sudden. Rather, it was like a slow poison creeping into their marriage. Ryan, who once couldn't go a day without texting her sweet messages, now barely spoke to her unless necessary. He started working late hours, making excuses about meetings and business trips. At first, Miriam brushed it off, convincing herself that he was just stressed with work. She didn't want to be the paranoid wife who doubted her husband over small things. Then, the real signs began to appear. He became secretive with his phone, always keeping it face down or taking calls in the other room. The passwords to their shared accounts were suddenly changed, and when she asked, he dismissed it as a security update. He started dressing differently, suddenly interested in buying expensive colognes, upgrading his wardrobe, and hitting the gym regularly, all things he never cared about before. Miriam noticed it all, but she stayed silent. One evening, as she was folding laundry, she found a receipt in his pocket from a high-end restaurant in downtown Houston. The date was from the previous week, a night he had told her he was stuck at the office late. Her hands trembled as she stared at the bill, which had dinner for 2 and a bottle of expensive wine. Miriam felt her heart sink, but she still wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. Maybe it was a work dinner. Maybe he had entertained a client. She was desperate to hold on to hope, but deep inside, she knew. She started paying closer attention. When he said he was working late, she drove by his office just to check. Twice, she found the parking lot empty. She started noticing that his credit card statements had transactions she couldn't recognize, jewelry stores, boutique hotels, flights she had no knowledge of. The evidence was piling up, but Miriam still didn't confront him. Instead, she played along, acting as if she was clueless, all the while gathering every little detail. Then came the moment that shattered any last illusion she had. A friend of hers, Anaya, worked at a hotel in Houston. One afternoon, she called Miriam, her voice hesitant. "I don't know if I should be telling you this, but I saw Ryan at the hotel yesterday. He wasn't alone. I didn't approach him, but I knew you deserved to know." Miriam felt the air leave her lungs. Her worst fears had come true. That night, she lay beside Ryan in bed, staring at the ceiling while he slept peacefully, completely unaware that she knew his secret. The betrayal burned in her chest, but she refused to let him see her pain. Instead of reacting immediately, she decided she needed a plan. Ryan thought he had outsmarted her, that she was naive and oblivious. But he had no idea what was coming. Miriam spent the next few weeks preparing for what she knew was inevitable. She met with a lawyer, quietly gathered financial records, and ensured that if Ryan tried to leave her with nothing, he would fail. She documented every lie, every piece of evidence, every moment he had deceived her. And then she waited. She knew Ryan well enough to predict his next move. He was going to leave her soon, and when he did, she would be ready. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. Miriam's world had turned into a stage where she played the role of an unsuspecting wife, all while knowing the script by heart. Every morning, she woke up next to Ryan, made him breakfast, and kissed him goodbye as he left for work, pretending nothing had changed. But in reality, everything had. She was no longer the naive woman who believed in his excuses. She was now a silent observer, watching every move he made, waiting for the perfect moment to act. She had learned long ago that emotions could be a weakness, and she refused to let them cloud her judgment now. Ryan, oblivious to her newfound awareness, had grown bolder in his deception. His late nights at work became more frequent, his excuses lazier. Sometimes, he didn't even bother coming up with an explanation. He had started treating her like a ghost, present but invisible, an afterthought in his life. And yet, Miriam played along. She smiled, laughed at his jokes, and pretended to be the same loving wife she had always been. It was a delicate act, and she had to be careful. If he sensed anything unusual, he might change his plans, and she couldn't afford that. She needed him to think he was still in control. One evening, as she sat in their bedroom pretending to read a book, she overheard Ryan on the phone in the next room. His voice was low, cautious, but not careful enough. "I'll be there soon." "Yeah, she doesn't suspect anything." "No, I promise. It's almost done." Almost done. Miriam's grip on the book tightened. He was talking about their marriage as if it were a business deal he was about to close. A transaction. A final step before he walked away without looking back. She had spent the past few weeks gathering everything she needed: bank statements, property documents, records of his shady transactions. She had even found proof of his infidelity, thanks to a private investigator she had quietly hired. At first, she had debated whether she wanted to go that far, whether she truly needed to see the evidence with her own eyes. But when the investigator sent her pictures of Ryan with another woman at a resort in Miami, laughing, holding hands, looking at her the way he used to look at Miriam, it had solidified her resolve. She knew the woman, too. A younger coworker from Ryan's office, someone Miriam had met at a company dinner months ago. She had been polite, overly friendly even, complimenting Miriam's dress, telling her how lucky she was to have a husband like Ryan. The memory made her stomach turn. How long had they been lying to her face? How many times had Ryan come home after being with this woman, kissed Miriam's forehead, and told her he loved her? The thought made her sick, but she forced herself to stay calm. Instead of confronting him, she dug deeper. She found out that Ryan had secretly moved large sums of money into a private account under his name. He had even inquired about selling their house without informing her. He had been planning his escape for months, ensuring that when he left, he would have everything while she would be left with nothing. But what he didn't know was that Miriam was one step ahead. One night, she went through his briefcase while he was in the shower. Inside, she found legal documents, drafts of a divorce agreement, papers indicating he was preparing to file soon. It was all there, in black and white. He was going to blindside her, make it look like an amicable split, while ensuring she walked away with as little as possible. The betrayal was complete. Miriam had spent 15 years building a life with this man, supporting him, sacrificing for him, only to be discarded like an old habit. But she refused to be a victim. The next day, while Ryan was at work, she met with her lawyer again. They adjusted their strategy, making sure she was protected. Miriam also made copies of all the evidence she had collected, proof of his affair, his financial manipulations, even his attempts to hide assets. She wasn't just going to survive this. She was going to make sure he regretted ever underestimating her. Despite everything, she still struggled to wrap her mind around it. How had the man she loved turned into a stranger? When had he decided that she was no longer worth his loyalty? Had she been blind all these years, or had he simply become better at hiding who he truly was? There were no answers, only a deep, aching sense of betrayal that she carried with her every day. But instead of letting it destroy her, she let it fuel her. The final confirmation came a week later. Miriam had installed a tracking app on Ryan's phone, a small, discreet move that he never noticed. That evening, while he told her he was working late again, she checked his location. He wasn't at the office. He was at a high-end restaurant in downtown Houston. Without hesitation, Miriam grabbed her keys and drove there. She didn't walk inside, didn't cause a scene. She simply parked across the street and watched. Through the restaurant's large glass windows, she saw him. Ryan was sitting at a corner table, leaning close to the same woman from the pictures. They were laughing, their hands intertwined on the table, oblivious to everything around them. He looked happy. Happier than he had been in years. And in that moment, Miriam felt something shift inside her. The pain was still there, but it was no longer sharp. It was dull now, numbing, turning into something else. As she sat in her car, watching the man she had loved for 15 years betray her so openly, she made a silent promise to herself. He thought he had won. He thought he had planned everything perfectly. But he had no idea what was coming. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. Miriam drove home that night in silence, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had always heard stories about betrayal, read about them in novels, seen them in movies, but she had never imagined she would be the one living through it. The man she had built her life around, the one she had sacrificed so much for, was now sitting in a fancy restaurant, holding another woman's hand like their 15 years together meant nothing. The weight of it pressed against her chest, suffocating, but she refused to let the tears fall. She had already spent too many nights crying over a man who clearly had no remorse. Instead, she focused on what needed to be done next. By the time she reached home, she had already made up her mind. Ryan wanted to play dirty, to manipulate the situation so that he could walk away unscathed, leaving her with nothing. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She wasn't the same woman who had blindly trusted him, who had spent years putting his happiness before her own. That version of Miriam had died the moment she saw him laughing with another woman, his betrayal shining under the soft glow of the restaurant's chandeliers. She spent the next few days pretending like everything was normal, watching him carefully, waiting for his next move. He had no idea that she had seen him that night, that she had been sitting in her car across the street, memorizing every moment. She wondered if he ever felt guilty, if he ever looked at her and thought about the lies he had told, the promises he had broken. But if he did, he never showed it. He still came home late, still gave her half-hearted excuses, still treated her like a stranger in her own home. Then, one afternoon, the moment she had been waiting for finally arrived. Miriam was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. A few minutes later, the front door opened, and Ryan stepped inside. She turned to greet him, masking her emotions like she had done for weeks. But before she could say anything, he spoke first. "We need to talk." His voice was calm, almost too calm, like he had practiced this conversation in his head 100 times. She nodded, wiping her hands on a towel, and followed him into the living room. He sat on the couch, rubbing his hands together nervously, while she took a seat across from him. "Miriam," he began, avoiding her eyes, "I've been thinking about this for a while now. I don't want to hurt you, but I think we both know that things haven't been working between us." Miriam tilted her head slightly, feigning confusion. "What do you mean?" He let out a deep sigh, as if the weight of his own lies was exhausting him. "I think it's best if we go our separate ways. I want a divorce." She stared at him for a long moment, letting the words settle in the air between them. He was expecting her to break down, to cry, to beg him to reconsider. That's what men like him wanted: power, control. But Miriam had already mourned the end of this marriage. She had already shed her tears in silence. Now, all that was left was a quiet, calculated rage. "Okay," she said simply, her voice steady. Ryan blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Okay." She nodded. "If that's what you want, then I won't stop you." He hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for her to change her mind, but when she didn't, he relaxed. He thought he had won. He had no idea that she had already taken control of the situation long before he sat down to have this conversation. Over the next few days, Ryan acted like a man who had been set free. He started packing some of his things, making phone calls in hushed tones, probably arranging his new life with the woman he had been seeing. Miriam pretended not to notice, but inside, she was counting down the days until he realized the truth. She had already spoken to her lawyer, already secured her finances, already gathered all the evidence she needed. Ryan had been so focused on his own plans that he never once suspected that she had been preparing for this moment too. Then, on the morning of their scheduled court meeting, everything unraveled. Ryan walked into the room with confidence, expecting a smooth process, expecting to walk away without any consequences. But the moment Miriam's lawyer presented the evidence, proof of his infidelity, proof of his hidden assets, proof of his attempts to manipulate their financial situation, his entire demeanor changed. His face paled, his hands clenched into fists. He turned to look at her, disbelief written all over his face. "You set me up," he whispered, his voice laced with anger. Miriam met his gaze, her expression unreadable.
"No, Ryan."
"You set yourself up." For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. She had spent too long feeling helpless, feeling like she had no control over her own life. But now, as she watched the realization dawn on his face, she knew that she had won. He had underestimated her, thought she would crumble the moment he decided to leave. But instead, she had turned the tables on him. By the time the proceedings were over, Ryan had lost more than he had ever expected. Miriam walked away with her fair share of their assets, ensuring that she and her children wouldn't suffer because of his betrayal. He, on the other hand, was left scrambling, trying to fix the mess he had created. And as Miriam stepped out of the courthouse that day, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, she realized something. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. Miriam sat in her car outside the courthouse for a long time, staring at the building where everything had finally unraveled. The weight of 15 years had been lifted off her shoulders, but the scars they left behind still ached. Ryan had walked out minutes before her, his face tight with anger, humiliation burning in his eyes. He had lost, and he knew it. She had seen it in the way his hands clenched into fists, the way his jaw tightened as he stormed off without a word. For a man who had been so sure of his control, it must have been unbearable to realize that Miriam had outmaneuvered him at every turn. But she didn't feel victorious, not in the way she had imagined. Winning against someone who was never truly worth her time didn't feel like a win. It felt like closure. As she started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, the memories of the last few months played in her mind like a silent film. The secret bank accounts Ryan thought she would never find. The late-night phone calls he had assumed she would never overhear. The conversations with lawyers, the careful planning, the sleepless nights spent crafting her escape. She had seen this moment coming long before he had, and she had prepared. But now that it had arrived, she wasn't sure what to do with herself. She had spent so long fighting, surviving. What did life look like when there was no longer a battle to wage? She drove through the familiar streets of Chicago, past the parks where she had once taken her children when they were small, past the coffee shops where she and Ryan had once sat together, back when love still felt real. The city felt different now, or maybe it was she who had changed. She had walked into the courthouse as a woman trapped in a broken marriage and walked out as someone entirely new, free, but uncertain. When she reached home, the house felt foreign to her. Ryan had taken most of his belongings, but his presence still lingered in small, unexpected places. The jacket he had forgotten to pack still hung by the door. His cologne still clung to the air in their bedroom. The empty side of the closet where his clothes had once been felt like a void, a reminder of what was gone. She stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the space around her, wondering how she had let her life become so entwined with a man who had never truly valued her. The first few days after the divorce were a strange blur. Friends and family called, offering words of support, but Miriam didn't know how to respond. She wasn't grieving, but she wasn't celebrating either. She had won the legal battle, but the emotional war was something else entirely. She had to unlearn the habits of a life spent revolving around someone else. She had to remind herself that she didn't need permission to make decisions anymore, that she didn't have to justify her choices to anyone but herself. It was liberating but also terrifying. Then, one morning, she woke up and realized she didn't have to live in the shadow of her past anymore. She didn't have to tiptoe around the memory of a man who had taken so much from her. She could start over.
And so she did.
She began with small things, rearranging the furniture, replacing the bedsheets, buying herself flowers for the first time in years. It felt strange at first, indulging in these small acts of self-care, but slowly, she started to remember who she was before Ryan had dimmed her light. She threw herself into work, picking up extra projects, rediscovering the passion she had once had for her career. She reconnected with old friends, people she had unintentionally drifted away from during her marriage. She started going out more, taking long walks along the lake, sitting in coffee shops alone, learning to enjoy her own company. For the first time in years, she was making choices for herself, and it felt good. But just as she was beginning to rebuild, Ryan reappeared. It started with small things, a text here, a missed call there. At first, she ignored it, refusing to let him pull her back into his world. But then, one evening, he showed up at her doorstep, his face carefully crafted into an expression of regret. She should have slammed the door in his face, should have told him to leave, but curiosity got the best of her. She wanted to hear what he had to say, if only to confirm that she had made the right decision. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice softer than she had ever heard it before. "I should never have left." Miriam crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You didn't leave, Ryan. You betrayed me. There's a difference." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I was stupid. I thought I wanted something else. But now that you've lost, you want to come back?" She let out a bitter laugh. "That's not how it works." "I miss you," he said, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away before he could touch her. "No, you miss control," she corrected. "You miss having someone to manipulate, someone who will sacrifice themselves for your happiness. But that's not me anymore." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw it. The realization that the woman he had once taken for granted was gone. Miriam had changed, and there was no going back. She didn't give him the closure he was looking for. She simply stepped back, shut the door, and walked away. As she stood in the middle of her living room, surrounded by the life she was slowly rebuilding, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. Miriam didn't hear from Ryan again after that night. His attempts to regain control over her had failed, and she knew his pride wouldn't let him come crawling back a second time. But even in his absence, his presence still lingered in her life. There were moments when she caught herself expecting to hear his voice when the phone rang, or when she instinctively hesitated before making big decisions, as if waiting for his approval. It was strange, unlearning the habits of 15 years, but she was determined to reclaim her independence, piece by piece. One afternoon, she found herself sitting alone in a cafe in downtown Chicago, watching the world move around her. The city was alive with its usual energy: business people rushing between meetings, tourists snapping photos, couples walking hand in hand. She used to come here often when she was younger, before her life had been consumed by marriage and responsibility. Back then, she had dreams of traveling, of opening her own business, of living life on her own terms. Somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of those dreams, but now, for the first time in years, they felt within reach again. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through old messages from her best friend, Aisha, who had been urging her to take a trip somewhere. "You need a change of scenery," Aisha had said more times than Miriam could count. "Come to New York for a few days. It'll be good for you." Miriam had always made excuses: work, finances, the kids. But now, there was nothing stopping her. She had money saved up, her children were older and supportive of her newfound independence, and work could wait. On impulse, she booked a flight. New York was overwhelming in the best way possible. The moment she stepped off the plane, she felt like she was stepping into a different world, a world where she wasn't defined by her past. Aisha met her at the airport with a wide grin, pulling her into a tight hug. "Finally," she exclaimed. "You're free, and you're here. This calls for a celebration." The next few days were a blur of laughter, late-night conversations, and rediscovering the simple joys of life. They explored Central Park, ate at little restaurants hidden in the corners of the city, and talked about everything Miriam had been holding inside for years. She told Aisha about the loneliness she had felt in her marriage, about the fear of starting over, about the guilt that still lingered despite knowing she had done the right thing. "You don't owe him anything," Aisha reminded her one evening as they sat on a rooftop bar overlooking the city. "Not your guilt, not your time, not your forgiveness. You gave him 15 years. Now, it's your turn to live." Something shifted in Miriam that night. For so long, she had been carrying the weight of her past, but she finally realized she didn't have to anymore. She didn't need to feel guilty for choosing herself. She didn't need to hold on to the pain of what had been. She was allowed to move forward. When she returned to Chicago, she felt different. Lighter. More sure of herself. She threw herself into her work with renewed energy, taking on projects that excited her. She redecorated her home, turning it into a space that truly reflected who she was. She started going out more, meeting new people, opening herself up to the possibilities of what life had to offer. And then one evening she met someone. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something she had even been looking for. But as she stood in line at a bookstore, flipping through the pages of a novel, she felt someone's eyes on her. When she looked up, a man stood a few feet away, smiling at her. He was tall, with warm brown eyes and an easy confidence about him. "That's a great book," he said, nodding toward the one in her hands. She hesitated for a moment before responding. "You've read it?" "Twice," he admitted. "It's one of my favorites." They talked for a few minutes, exchanging book recommendations, and before she knew it, she was giving him her number. His name was Daniel, and over the next few weeks, he slowly became a part of her world. He was kind in a way that felt unfamiliar to her, not the performative kindness she had known in the past, but something real and steady. He listened when she spoke, never interrupting or dismissing her thoughts. He made her laugh in a way she hadn't in years. But even as she found herself drawn to him, there was a part of her that hesitated. She had spent so long healing from her past that the idea of opening herself up to someone new felt terrifying. What if she got hurt again? What if she lost herself the way she had before? Daniel seemed to sense her hesitation, never pushing her beyond what she was comfortable with. He was patient, understanding, willing to take things at her pace. "You don't have to rush anything," he told her one evening as they walked along the Chicago River. "I just like spending time with you." And that was the moment Miriam realized something. She wasn't the same woman she had been in her marriage. She had changed. She had grown. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to let happiness find her again. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. Miriam found herself smiling more often, a genuine kind of happiness she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just because of Daniel, though he had certainly become a comforting presence in her life. It was because she was finally learning to embrace herself, to enjoy her own company, to wake up each morning without the lingering heaviness of regret. She had built a new routine, one filled with long walks along Lake Michigan, afternoons spent in cozy cafes, and evenings curled up with a good book. She was working on herself in a way she never had before, and it felt good. But change, no matter how positive, always comes with its challenges. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something in her gut told her to pick up. The moment she heard the voice on the other end, her stomach clenched. It was Ryan. "Miriam," he said, his voice carefully measured. "I think we need to talk." She hadn't heard from him in months, and now, just as she was settling into her new life, here he was. She didn't respond immediately, waiting for him to continue. "Look," he sighed, "I know things ended badly between us, but I've been thinking about everything. About us. About what went wrong." Miriam took a deep breath, gripping the phone a little tighter. "And what exactly do you want from me, Ryan?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. "I just want to meet. One conversation. That's all." She hesitated. Part of her wanted to shut him down immediately, to tell him there was nothing left to say. But another part of her, perhaps the part that still needed closure, was curious. She agreed to meet him the next day, choosing a neutral, public place, a small cafe in downtown Chicago. When she arrived, She spotted him immediately. He looked the same, but different. The sharpness in his eyes had dulled, his usual arrogance replaced with something else. Maybe regret, maybe exhaustion. He stood when she approached, offering a hesitant smile. "Thanks for coming," he said as she took a seat across from him. She nodded, but didn't return the smile. "What did you want to talk about?" He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I messed up," he admitted, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I took you for granted. I didn't appreciate you the way I should have. And now I see it." Miriam studied him, searching for signs of manipulation, for the Ryan she had once known. But this version of him seemed different. Tired.
Lost.
"And what do you expect me to do with that information?" she asked, her tone neutral. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess. I just wanted to say it, to acknowledge it. And maybe—" He paused, looking at her with something that almost resembled hope. "Maybe we could try again?" Miriam let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "Ryan, you divorced me the second things got inconvenient for you. You treated me like an afterthought for years. And now that I've finally moved on, now that I'm finally happy, you think you can just walk back into my life?" He flinched at her words, but didn't argue. "I was stupid," he said. "I see that now." She shook her head, feeling a strange mix of emotions: pity, frustration, relief. "I don't hate you, Ryan," she said, surprising even herself. "But I don't love you anymore either. And I don't think I ever will again." For the first time, she saw real pain flash across his face. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of their relationship. Now he was powerless, and he knew it. He nodded slowly, as if finally accepting the truth. "I understand," he murmured. She stood up, ready to leave. "Take care of yourself, Ryan." As she walked away, she felt lighter than she ever had before. She had closed the final door to her past, and now, nothing was holding her back. That evening, she met Daniel for dinner, and as she sat across from him, she realized just how different this felt. There were no power struggles, no hidden resentment, no fear of being unloved. With Daniel, she could simply be herself, without apology. "You seem at peace," he observed, watching her closely. She smiled, nodding. "I think I finally am." Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. Miriam had always imagined what true happiness might feel like, but she never thought she would actually experience it. After years of feeling unseen, unheard, and undervalued, she had finally stepped into a life that felt like her own. The encounter with Ryan had solidified everything she had been working towards. She no longer needed his validation, nor did she hold on to the past with bitterness. She was free. And with that newfound freedom came a sense of purpose, one she hadn't felt in years. She began exploring new interests, finding joy in things that once seemed trivial. She started taking photography classes, capturing the essence of Chicago's streets, its people, the stories hidden in ordinary moments. The city, which once felt like a backdrop to her struggles, now felt alive, vibrant, and full of possibilities. Daniel encouraged her, always pushing her to pursue what made her happy. "You've got an eye for this," he told her one evening as they sat by the lake, looking through the photos she had taken. "You capture emotions, not just moments." His words meant more to her than she could express, not because she needed his approval, but because for the first time, she was allowing herself to believe in her own talents. One afternoon, she got a message from an old friend, Sarah, someone she had lost touch with during her marriage. "Miriam, I saw your pictures on Instagram. They're amazing. Let's catch up soon." It felt strange, reconnecting with people she had once been close to, but it also felt right. She agreed to meet Sarah for coffee in a small cafe near Millennium Park. When she walked in, she saw Sarah waving enthusiastically from a corner table. She looked the same but different, more confident, more self-assured. They hugged, and for a moment, it was as if no time had passed. "I can't believe how long it's been," Sarah said, shaking her head. "How have you been?" "I mean, really?" Miriam smiled, stirring her coffee. "Better than I ever thought I could be." Sarah leaned in, her eyes filled with curiosity. "And Ryan?" What happened there? Miriam exhaled, a small laugh escaping her lips. He divorced me. Sarah's eyes widened. Wait, what? After all those years? Miriam nodded.
Yep.
15 years, and just like that, it was over. Sarah looked at her for a long moment before shaking her head. I never liked him, you know. He always seemed distracted, like he wasn't really present. Miriam appreciated the honesty.
Yeah.
I see that now. They talked for hours, reminiscing about their younger years, about the dreams they once had, the paths they had taken. You know, Sarah said, sipping her coffee thoughtfully, it's funny how life works. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to us is actually the best thing. Miriam nodded, realizing just how true that was. If Ryan hadn't left, she might still be stuck in a life that wasn't hers. But now she was thriving. She had love, friendship, and most importantly, she had herself. That night, as she walked back to her apartment, the city lights glowing around her, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: gratitude. Not just for the good things, but for the pain that had shaped her, for the heartbreak that had led her here. She thought about Daniel, about how he had been there for her, not as a savior, but as a reminder that she was capable of love again. As she unlocked her door, her phone buzzed. It was Daniel. Hey, he said, his voice warm. I was thinking there's this gallery showcasing local photographers next month. You should submit your work. Miriam hesitated, the old insecurities creeping in. I don't know, Daniel. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. He chuckled. Miriam, you're more than ready. You just need to believe it. She smiled, leaning against the doorframe. Okay, I'll think about it. But deep down, she already knew her answer. She was ready to step into this new chapter of her life, fully and fearlessly. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. Miriam stood in the middle of the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. The walls around her were lined with her photographs, moments she had captured throughout the past few months, stories she had told through her lens. Strangers walked past, pausing to admire her work, murmuring words of appreciation. She had never imagined herself here, standing in an art gallery in Chicago, showcasing something that was entirely her own. Just months ago, she had felt lost, discarded, uncertain of who she was without Ryan. And now, she was here, not just surviving but thriving. Daniel appeared by her side, his presence grounding her. You did it, he said, his voice filled with pride. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. I can't believe this is real. He turned to her, his expression serious. Miriam, this is just the beginning. You were never meant to live in someone else's shadow. This is you stepping into your own light. His words hit her deep, not just because they were true, but because they were exactly what she needed to hear. She had spent years molding herself into what Ryan wanted, what society expected, what she thought she should be. But none of that had ever been enough. Now, she wasn't trying to be enough for anyone but herself, and it was the most liberating feeling in the world. As the evening went on, she found herself lost in conversations with people who admired her work. A woman from a local magazine approached her, asking if she would be interested in featuring her photographs in an upcoming issue. A small business owner inquired about purchasing a few pieces for his office. The more she spoke, the more she realized that she had built something meaningful, something of her own. Later that night, after the gallery had emptied and she was left alone with Daniel, she took a deep breath, taking it all in. I feel like I've finally closed the door on my past, she admitted. He studied her for a moment before nodding. That's because you have. She thought about Ryan, about the years she had spent trying to be the wife he wanted, about how quickly he had walked away when it no longer suited him. But instead of anger, all she felt was indifference. He was just another chapter in her story, one that had led her here. And that was enough. As they stepped out into the chilly Chicago air, Miriam felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had built a life that was hers, surrounded by people who truly saw her, truly valued her. and that was more than she had ever hoped for.